I'm a managing director at CFA Institute. We're very proud to be a sponsor for the Virginia Film Festival, and particularly for this particular film, Abacus, that Gordon Quinn was the executive director of. And I'm privileged to be able to start off some Q&A. We'll start a discussion, but open it up to you as well for any of your questions. But Gordon, you've worked with Steve James for many years, starting with Hoop Dreams, and you are, of course, a legend, as was said. And I'm curious, how does one come to get to a story like this and identify it as a story that needs to be told?
You know, some films are incredibly difficult, and you look for the story, and you have to build, takes years sometimes to build trust with the people or families. This was a kind of fortuitous thing. Mark Mitton, one of the producers, knew Vera Sung. So he knew about this story, and he knew the family and was already trusted by the family. And that's why we were able to get into this incredible situation of being with them while the trial is going on. So often in a documentary, you're trying to kind of recreate and dip back into the past, but this is unfolding before our eyes. It was also an area that we had been interested in. I mean, many of us had a concern about what happened in 2008, and we're paying a lot of attention to that. You know, we never really thought we'd be making a film about a bank that we were rooting for.
So, well, that raises an interesting question. And by the way, I mean, the kind of the intimacy that those that shot the film seemed to have with the Sung family really came off the screen. So that explains, I think, a lot of what was there. Much better? Okay. So are banks good or are banks bad?
Well, you know, I mean, I'm not a financial expert, but in a sense, it's all there in It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, banks are essential. They do something that's really good, but it's just like anything else. It's like when people are dishonest, when the goal is merely the goal of profit, everything gets corrupted. I mean, people ask me sometimes, because of some other things that we've been involved in over the years, you know, are police good or are police bad? Well, we need the police, but we need the police to be doing what they're actually supposed to be doing. And if you get a police force that is, you know, has a code of silence, that is not protecting all of its citizens, you've got a problem. So I think, you know, I love that that they worked in It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, it's just such a fitting moment about what this film is really about.
Yeah, well, it opens up that way, and absolutely the parallels are undeniable. So is there a postscript to be told about the Sung family now? How are they doing?
Well, they're doing well, and you know, I like to say that you know, the family is the kind of family that I call, you know, it's like from documentary heaven. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that family and their relationship. The moment when they're all talking at once early in the film, it's just that, you know, you want to be able to build that kind of connection to an audience. But now, you know, post the film being released, Cyrus Vance is the gift that keeps on giving in terms of the release of the film. I mean, there's been several stories and scandals in the New York Times about, oh, and he didn't indict the Trump children on this charge or that charge, and they'll always mention the movie. So we're just like, you know, and I gather that Chantrell, the youngest daughter that was in his office, is actually running as he's unopposed, and it's too late for her to actually get on the ballot. But you can, if you're from New York, you can write her in. She's running as a write-in candidate against Cyrus Vance.
You and I were talking a little bit about impartiality in a documentary before the film. I'd love if you would just share a bit of that with the audience.
Well, you know, there is this myth of objectivity, and I really don't believe in, even though we make verite films where everything you see is something that was real or based on something real, like court drawings. But we know where we stand, and we let you know, the audience know, where we stand in this film. We clearly are standing with the family. However, Steve made an enormous attempt to get those interviews with Vance and the other prosecutor woman. When we were looking for jurors, we wanted to make sure that we found one who had been on the side of conviction. So you try to tell both sides of the story, which doesn't mean you can't be clear about where you stand.
Speaking of the jurors, none of us saw a juror that appeared to be from the Chinese immigrant community. Why was that, do you know?
You know, that's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. That's one that I think we would have to ask Steve. I suspect that there weren't any on the jury. They're underrepresented in the jury pool, and that's the kind of thing where the prosecutor, would have that ability to, to challenge them.
So, I would love to turn it over to the audience to ask questions of you. Before we do, what's the one key message that you and Steve James were trying to bring forward with this?
Well, one of the things that's great about the film, and I mentioned to you our other film, All the Queen's Horses, which is about the biggest municipal fraud in U.S. history, which happened to take place in Illinois, in Dixon, Illinois, Ronald Reagan's hometown. And we want, and this was a great opportunity for people to understand not just that we have this emotional story, we have this family, we have larger questions of justice, but we also are able to draw you into some of the nitty-gritty of what banks actually do and how fraud occurs and that kind of thing. And so I think that's something that really drew us to the story and, kind of in the struggling through the editing and things. How are we going to make sure that you walk out of here knowing something about banking that you didn't know when you came in?
Yeah, and I think that you definitely brought that forward. So we have a couple of people walking around with microphones. Not that it seems to matter much for me that's holding one and not using it properly. But back here, do you have a question?
Yes, I was just going to point out, I was a trial lawyer in New York for 32 years. And there are certain communities that do not respond to jury subpoenas. They don't want to end up on a jury. They're afraid of being involved in with all the gang prosecution against Asian gangs in Manhattan, where I practiced. The Chinese community is woefully underrepresented because they don't return jury subpoenas. Just tried a case in federal court in New York in December, and it was for an ethnic family. I won't go into details. You would have thought, based on the Southern District of New York, that their ethnicity would have been represented on the jury pool, and there was no one, not out of the 43 from which we selected a final jury of 6 and 2 alternates.
Wow, well, explain it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And from other things we're doing, this happens in the African American community too, that they may be in the jury pool, they may show up, but for instance, this was a few years ago, I was called for jury duty and I didn't use my usual things. I just kept going through the process, and now I'm sitting in the witness box and the lawyers are questioning us. And one of the questions was, because it was a murder case, has anyone on the jury, they wanted to know if anyone had been involved in a situation of gun violence. And all of the African Americans raised their hand. And at that point, he objected to them, and they were gone. So, there are lots of things that do affect the jury pool. I think that one of the things that I don't think we got it into the film, but some of the community members in China, some of the community leaders are really talking to the community about this issue, and that they have to vote, they have to come and serve on juries, they have to get involved civically, or they're going to continue to be victims.
Yeah. Well, in fact, there's perhaps even an argument to be made that the bank itself, Abacus, could be more aggressive in terms of making loans to the community. The default rate's infinitesimally small. I mean, in the banking world,
Microscopically.
I'm sorry, it's not microscopic. That apparently is, but it is quite low. And how would you react to that kind of a statement?
Well, I think that, and it's in there, you know, when the court case was massive, and of course the documentation was massive. So figuring out, and you know, Steve and the editors did a really amazing job of going through this mountain of material and figuring out which pieces of the story and of the prosecution of the defense are we going to put into telling the story. And one of the things that was important was to get in this idea of cultural sensitivity. It's like, you know, the regulations and the rules and those kind of things can be written to meet the needs of certain kind of communities, and maybe sometimes they have to be adjusted to meet the needs of other communities who aren't trying to defraud anything or necessarily. I mean, the whole thing about the gift letters was really, that was what we focused on, to sort of say, this is different, and you need to understand that.
You know, I can't help but ask this question because it relates to cultural sensitivity, but the whole chain gang thing. And regardless of whose decision that was, and to me, it wasn't clear, but you know, the Chinese have such a strong sensitivity to honor and face, and it's perhaps not a fair question to ask your impression of motive.
Well, we try to, you know, again, we're not the police, we're not prosecutors, but I think you get the idea that we're pretty clear from the statements that we use about it and the way we frame it, that this did come from Vance's office. It was actually, you know, to get in the papers. It's, you know, he's trying to make a name for himself, and it was absolutely outrageous. And you know, we try to portray it that way in the movie. You know, and we give him his say, but even when he, you know, again, he was kind of from documentary heaven too, you know, he stumbles around and he doesn't really have an answer, and then he amazingly says, well, I mean, no, wait, it's he who names these other, if it had been, you know, the African American or this community, we would have done exactly the same. You kind of left out the white community. Why didn't you mention that? Yeah, no, it was, you know, all of that, and that's how you tell a story. All of that's carefully structured.
Question.
Have you screened this in any law schools? And if you have, I'm curious as to the reaction of the young students and how the system is performing, and the reaction of some of the professors who may be more, used to or defensive of the system, politically, the political motivations as opposed to just serving justice.
Right. I haven't been at those screenings, but it is an important part of like our Cartemquin mission to get films. There are two communities we're trying to get it to, both the legal community, but also the Chinese community, and it's complicated. I won't go into the background, but we waged quite a battle to make sure that the DVD that's coming out, that is out now, you can select it, you can get it in Chinese. You can get the Chinese version of the film. So those kinds of things, both on the community level and on the professional level, are important to us. I haven't actually been at the screenings in law schools, but they've created some lively debates, and sometimes it's, you know, I'm sensing the mood of this audience, and there's a little more debate within those, you know, well, did the bank actually do something, or did they know, or should have known, that kind of thing. And so when you get up to the level of, you know, there will be more debate, but I think it's important for young lawyers and people who are going into the law and to the whole, you know, justice system to see and be exposed to these kinds of films, and we do that with one way or another with almost all our films.
Well, what about the Chinese community? I understand it was screened in Hong Kong in March. How is it received? Oh,
well, you know, I mean, you can kind of imagine. Okay. It's a total crowd pleaser to them. There are. And it's always, I love being in that kind of a screening with whatever film we're working on, because those are the people, they laugh at things that, you know, oh, that was funny, you know. I mean, they have all of the cultural nuance of the film, some of which we didn't even get when we were making it, comes out in those kind of screenings, and for this film in particular. The other thing that's been incredible is that the Songs, of course they totally embraced the film, but they've been at film festivals, they've traveled with us when the film was at Full Frame, we had them all there, the whole family is there, and you know, invariably Mrs. Sung will say something to embarrass one of the daughters in promotion, and you know.
That's wonderful. Question?
I just wanted to know, so I kind of was confused as to whether did you get the sense that the district attorney really truly needed a scapegoat for the 2008 crisis? Or did it seem to be more of a snowball rolling downhill, like a continuous effort to just kind of save face, and then it kind of ballooned into this?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I mean, and again, I don't know, you know, it's not in the film because we don't really know what their motivation was for bringing these charges in the first place. It's absurd that given what happened in 2000, I mean, I think it's partly because they felt a lot of heat that all the banks got off, all this incredible damage, cities that were destroyed. I mean, just really, you know, the consequences of that were enormous. And, you know, but on the other hand, it's absurd that you would go over, even if they were criminals, if you would go over such a teeny tiny little bank on its face is absurd. One of the people in the film does say, I think it was one of the jurors actually, once they did all of their grand jury investigation and once they, you know, had to make the decision of whether to go forward, when they looked at what they had, how could they have decided to go forward with this case? It was absurd. So we don't really understand how they made such bad decisions, even from their own interest, but that is one of the things that goes on in the justice system.
First, I want to say thank you so much for your work with this documentary. And my question is a little bit less about the content and more so about the production process. If the verdict had been unfavorable for the Sung family and for Abacus, would you still have moved forward with producing the documentary? And if so, how would your approach have been different?
Absolutely, and we were, you know, as I mentioned, we were filming them all through the trial. So by the time the trial ends, the movie is pretty well shot. There were some, you know, we found the jurors, there were some, you know, pickup shooting and a few interviews that were done, but we were deeply into it. And, you know, one of the things that I think about is in many of our films that are dealing with social justice issues, with violence, with other kinds of things, the film doesn't exactly have a happy ending. Or you're stretching and trying to show, despite these terrible injustices and these difficult situations, that families continue to struggle on. That, you know, you try to find some kind of a silver lining. We didn't have to do that with this film, but I'm sure we absolutely would have finished the film. We never would have walked away from it. We've done that in many situations where things don't have the traditional happy ending. But we too, at least for our characters, we try to land in a place that doesn't leave them abandoned.
Did the family talk about why it took them so long to uncover the fraud that was going on in the bank?
You know, you hear a little bit of it in the film, which is their bank, they're looking at documents that Fannie Mae is looking at too, and, you know, it didn't look fishy to Fannie Mae, it didn't look fishy to them. In our other film, All the Queen's Horses, about this $58 million fraud, it went on for 20 years through 3 city administrations with formal auditors and a bank. The bank and the auditors had been so bad that the city sued them in a civil suit, and once the kind of discovery and all of that, it never went to trial, they settled. So I think one could argue that they should have caught it earlier, but that's hindsight. And when you look at these kind of cases and these kinds of things, I mean, municipal fraud is a huge problem in America and all over the world. It's a several, I can't remember the number now, but it's a several $trillion fraud, a huge number. And it's going on all the time, where you look back and it's like, how could they have not seen this? How could they have not gotten it? And yet, they missed it. And I know, just a quick note, when I was working on the other film, and we really go into how fraud happens, and I'm learning you don't have the same person writing the check, signing the check, approving the invoice, and we make that point very strongly. And I was like, oh, gee, we have these two corporations, and the same person in our organization is handling everything. And I went to our financial person, and I said, hey, I think we're maybe doing this wrong. And she was like, I've been telling you that for years. You're not listening. She was like, yes, of course we should change it.
There's been such a great focus in the last, especially, I think, 10 years in documentary filmmaking on social impact, and Quinn has, of course, done important work in that area. I'm curious with this film, what sort of social impact are you seeking, and how do you want audiences to get engaged?
So I think I referred to it a little bit earlier. We definitely wanted to have an impact in immigrant communities. And, as this gentleman was saying, that this is a film that I think can be shown in immigrant communities and encourage them to get involved in the civic life of their communities and to vote and to hold elected officials accountable to how their community is treated. I also think there's a whole educational component to the film that has to do with, the law schools and other kinds of, financial. It's great that you guys are sponsoring this, by the way, because, I think that this is a film that in the financial community and people who in the other film, the woman who made the film was a forensic accountant. In other words, that these kind of stories are important to people who are going into the fields like the law, like finance, and that kind of thing.
That does raise a question, and if I can jump in here, is that, this is a documentary where there's some underlying technical understanding that needs to be absorbed to tell the broader social story, which is a challenge, and which you've done before. How do you do that?
It's, I actually believe this about people. Sometimes we have a film and some people will ask me, well, how could you have decided to make a film about that character? They're so unappealing, or they're so boring, and yet they've been moved by the film, And I really believe that ultimately you can make a film. I mean, this family was easy, but ultimately everyone has a story, and you can make a film about that. And I also think that that's true of these kinds of things. When we're working on All the Queen's Horses, Kelly, who's the accounting professor, would say to me, well, we can't go into that. Accounting is boring. I said, that's our job, to find a way to make it dramatic, to make it something that people are like, and in that film we used animation, we did some things to really try and take you into the nuts and bolts of what's going on. And I think in this film, it was critical that the audience be able to understand what it is that's being talked about, and to be able to do that with the records that we have, with the transcript of the trial and all of that stuff, where you can you look through and it's like, oh, you put this with this and this, and okay, now we've told a little story about how somebody might lie about one of these things.
Yeah, I keep trying to tell my friends and family that what I do is in fact dramatic, and I haven't been able to make that sell yet. But I think there's a question back here.
No, I was just going to say, I also really loved, and I know this was just gratuitous, that it was all daughters.
Yeah.
Because they were all involved in the business, and then even the ones that weren't, one was a lawyer, one was a physician, and they all just sort of came together, and that was compelling too.
Yeah, and Mrs. Sung said it, talks about her daughters and their strength, and yeah, I think that's really important. And you know, we have other films that are specifically that deal with gender issues and with women. And we have a film we did a few years ago that deals with young women in high school and how important it can be to their development as leaders to be able to participate in team sports, which they were kept out of for so many years. Title IX changed a lot of that. But sometimes you're getting at something that I think is what's wonderful about documentaries. It's sort of you wouldn't say that that's why we made this film, and yet we know it's very much a part of the story that's being told. So there are all these secondary threads and issues and things that will be in a documentary that aren't necessarily you know, what you put on the poster.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, so I have a very dear friend from Beijing, and I was asking her, how would I say hello, how are you in Mandarin? And she said there really isn't much of a translation for that. It'd be more like, hello, have you eaten? Can we take you somewhere to eat? Was that a conscious choice on you to show? I mean, there was a vast amount of breaking of bread in this movie, so I was just wondering if that was like a conscious choice.
You know, one, it's the family, and it's where we knew that I think if you look at the body of our work, you will see there's a lot of meals, because that's where families interact. And so we did a film called The New Americans about immigrants coming to America now. It was a television series, a 7-hour series, and there's a lot of meals in that. And so it's a fairly, I don't know if it's a sub-theme in our work, but yeah, you'll see a lot, and a lot of time, and you know, figuring out how to get the sound at a meal, because it can be in a restaurant, or it can be noisy, or people are all talking at once. Here, that was, of course, we made it into a scene, you know. But yeah, I mean, breaking bread is something that I think is a place to be very revealing about what people are really like, and also ways to get people across certain kinds of divides. I made a film a few years ago called Unity Dinners, where it was about the African American community in Chicago and an adjacent Latino community. There were gang issues, there were a lot of, you know, things across that border, and someone had the idea, hey, let's invite each other to come into we will cook for you, you will come into our community, we'll have this group meal and talk about our issues, and then we'll come into your community. And so I think food is, you know, kind of a core value across cultures.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. It was a great screening, and I want to thank all my colleagues at CFA Institute for coming out for this screening and supporting this. This is a tremendous effort. Thank you.